Welcome to session number 5 in our series of online presentations. This one is entitled The Plagues, an Introduction. Remember that we've been looking at Moses and the things he has gone through and experienced in his attempt to be God's leader, taking the Hebrews out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And in this session and the next one, we'll see the front end of the battle that's ready to begin between Pharaoh and Yahweh. But first, let's take a couple of minutes and explain why we do some of the things we do when we're studying Scripture. Some people believe that this particular study is going a little bit too much in detail, or that we're off on rabbit trails or something, but there's a reason for that. Let me ask you this question. Could it be that your knowledge of Scripture is gappy? That there are gaps in it? Places where you have holes in your knowledge that do not allow you to make a connection between new information and old. Well, we prefer that not happen. Let me ask you 3 specific questions that'll get at this a bit. Number 1, does your studying include only reading? Number 2, does it seem like often, or even most of the time, you don't seem to come away with much of any new understanding or knowledge? And number 3, do you ever stop and try intentionally to make connections between things you know and things you're running into as you read? Okay? If you happen to answer no to each of those 3 questions, it's a virtual lock that you have gappy knowledge. You have knowledge, perhaps lots of knowledge, but if there are holes that prevent you from making connections between new information and old information, that is not a good situation. So when we come to new pieces of information, how can we handle it? Well, there are essentially 4 different event types that could take place. First, when you run into new information, perhaps your knowledge says, I know some connections to it. And if you have an ability to connect the new information with the old information, that's a virtual guarantee that you will remember the new information and be able to pull it up and use it whenever you need it. Your memory will improve. The second is when you run into new information and you don't see a connection with anything that you already know. It looks like an isolated bit of information. That's not good. We need to take time to stop and intentionally seek out connections between that piece of information and something we already know. And that's hard work sometimes. But once you make those connections, it's just like in the earlier case, that knowledge is yours. That knowledge is usable. That knowledge is valuable. That's still a good situation. Now, it might be that when you run into new, unconnected information, you simply memorize it. Whatever your memory process is, you make sure that it's fixed in your mind. But recall, or think about it for a moment, it's in your mind, okay, but it's still not connected, meaning that it's not terribly useful It won't be useful until you can connect it to something you already know. So it's not a waste of time to memorize something that you have no connections with, but it has limited value. Now, what is the fourth situation? Well, the fourth situation is totally unacceptable. That's when you run into a new piece of information and you don't bother to stop. You just keep reading. I guarantee that new information is going in one ear and right out the other one. 2-3 days from now, or even sooner, you won't remember it. It will have zero value for you. When it comes to sanctification, of course, and growth in your Christian life, you need to have an increasing understanding of Scripture. There's a key factor of education that we're really talking about here, and it goes something like this. Learning and growing require connections being made between existing knowledge and new information. That's the reason why we sometimes go to extra detail trying to make those connections, or even down some people's rabbit trails. We're trying to make connections with what you already know. And we're now at the top of the war that's brewing between Pharaoh and God. We're going to be looking at that war, but this is a good time to stop and realize there is a lot more to each of those segments of the war than is apparent by surface reading. So we're going to be looking at these, and I've got a series of 9 questions I want to ask you. We will be looking to answer these questions. You don't need to memorize them now, but there are kinds of things that we're going to be looking out for. For example, number 1, what was God's primary goal for winning the battle with Pharaoh? We've actually talked about it before. There's no big mystery to it. Second question, why didn't God end the war in one single battle? Isn't he capable of winning a war with just one battle? Or does he have to fight skirmish after skirmish after skirmish? Well, my God could do it in one step if he wanted to. How can we be sure that the plagues were not simply natural occurrences, but were in fact honest to goodness miracles? There are a lot of people who believe they were solely natural occurrences. Why did the series of events begin at the Nile River? What is there about the Nile River that makes it a starting point? Now, did God have a particular purpose in the choice of each plague? Or were they simply convenient tools for him to use in these battles? Question number 6, is there a structure to the 9 plagues that we're going to look at, tying them together into a coherent strategy? Or was God just playing it by ear? Be careful of that one, of course, because God is an intentional God. He plays nothing by ear. How is God going to take Pharaoh's henchmen, the sorcerers, the magicians, the wise men? How is he going to take them out of the battle? Because remember, on that first go-round with the snakes and the game of snakes, those guys were instrumental, perhaps, in buoying the spirits of Pharaoh so that he resisted God. So God may want to take them out of the fight before too long. Now, is God intentional or opportunistic? I've already said that my God is intentional. Just how powerful is the God you worship? How sure are you of his abilities? Well, when we finish the study of this war, what will you remember a year from now that you don't know now or don't remember now? In other words, when we study these 9, I'd like to come away with the feeling that a year from now, you can tell me things about this battle, this series of 9 plagues that you didn't know before. It'll be there in your memory, accessible to you by the right triggers. Now, those are all general questions. You still got each of the 9 plagues. And when you think about each of those plagues individually, there are bound to be other questions that come up. Well, there will be plenty of them. Well, this is enough preaching about the need to be an aggressive person when it comes to studying the Bible. And by the way, I hope you've noticed that this half hour is only an introduction. The first real battle takes place in the next session. But we're going to examine all of these things. Now, the principal goals, we have 2 of them for this session and the next. The first one is to understand the structure of the series of the 9 plagues. That these act as a warm-up for the big battle, the mother of all battles, as some Middle Eastern people are known to say. And once we know that, then we'll move on to the first plague, and we'll find out more about the plague where water was turned into blood. Now, does that have a familiar ring? Water to blood? Wasn't there somewhere in Scripture where water was turned to something else that was red? Well, I imagine you know that. Well, keep in mind, and this was already the answer to the first question, God's singular purpose in all of this was to free the Hebrew people from Egyptian bondage and move them into freedom in the Promised Land. That was the primary, first round, first rate, top flight purpose and goal. But the process of securing that freedom raised 2 subsidiary goals. And they're something like this. Number 1, that the descendants of Jacob, that's the Hebrews, the Israelites, that they know without a doubt that Yahweh is God and that Yahweh is responsible for their freedom. And the second is that the Egyptians know the same thing, that the polytheistic, pantheistic Egyptians know that there's just one God, and that God is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now, why might it have been important that the Egyptians know who Yahweh was? Well, I can't guarantee anything, but I do know this. At the early stages of Christianity, the Christian message spread quickly through North Africa by going through Egypt. Egypt was a center at Alexandria of some Christian study, and therefore it may have been very important that they were prepared to know about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, there's a problem. In order to get at those 2 subsidiary goals, God needed to prove something. He needed to prove that he was superior to Pharaoh. Pharaoh couldn't stop him. And that he was superior to every Egyptian god. No Egyptian god could withstand him. That when God or Yahweh says, I will, you know he will. So that's where all the 9 plagues come in. In these 9 plagues, God is targeting individual Egyptian deities. And he's showing them who is boss, who is sovereign, who has the power. Like a sniper, As we go through these 9 plagues, God is going to pick off these Egyptian gods one at a time. It's a beautiful thing to think about. Now, this shouldn't have been a surprise to Pharaoh. During the time that Aaron's snake ate the henchman's snakes, they should have recognized that this was saying the God of Israel is bigger than the gods of Egypt, because his snake ate their snakes. Culturally, they should have recognized that, but that didn't get the job done. So more was required, but don't worry, God is up to the task. Now, here's an interesting side question, and maybe of interest, may not be. Can you name any of the sorcerers, magicians, or wise men of Egypt? Well, I don't know that any of us can, but as a clue, perhaps, in 2 Timothy 3:8, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, this may have been the name of a couple of those wise guys. Well, let's look at the set of 9 plagues for a moment. Just going to take a few minutes and show that there is structure to them. God didn't just happenstance with these things. It was planned. The 9 divide nicely into 3 sets of triples or trios, 3 sets of 3 events each. The first 3 plagues constitute trio number 1. Plagues number 4, 5, and 6, number 2, and plagues 7, 8, and 9, trio number 3. And it's interesting, in each of the 3 trios, the first plague in each one, which would have been plague number 1, 4, and 7, all of those gave Pharaoh a warning that something was about to happen. Each of those took place early in the morning at the Nile, although number 7 doesn't specify the Nile. It likely took place at the Nile also. And that in each case, God gave a statement purpose for the set of 3. What were these 3 going to try and accomplish? So God gave a statement purpose for them. Now, in each of the sets also, the second entry, which have been plagues number 2, 5, and 8, they also included a warning to Pharaoh that something was about to happen, but they weren't given at the Nile, they were given at Pharaoh's palace. Okay? The third in each triple was interesting. No warnings given. Pharaoh had no clue that numbers 3, 6, and 9 were going to happen. But happen they did. Now, the 3 sets also go through what's called an increased severity. In other words, the plagues number 1, 2, and 3 were just irritations. They might even be considered minor. They weren't minor in some contexts, but they were the simplest and least problematic for Pharaoh. And that was the blood turned to water, frogs everywhere, gnats everywhere, or some kind of insect everywhere. Then things got a little bit tougher when you went to plagues 4, 5, and 6, the second trio, because now you have destructive flies. They may even have been blood-sucking flies, we don't know for sure. But there was going to be a plague on livestock, and man and beast was going to experience boils, which sort of took some of the wise men out of the picture a bit. Okay? Well, what about the last, the third? How is it more severe than boils? Well, death. The last 3, 7, 8, and 9, talked at one point about the death of man and beast by hail. It was interesting because in that one, the Egyptians were given enough of a warning that they could escape that death by hail. Then there was death of crops which of course meant ability to eat and commerce, a number of things, and death by darkness, as I term it. Well, within each trio, the severity increased with each succeeding plague. For example, number 2 was more severe than number 1. Number 3 was more severe than number 2. Then you jump to the next set. Number 4 was more severe than number 3, and on down the line. Okay, so the severity increased continually. Now, there's a question of tools and words, as I've titled it. In Numbers 1, 2, and 3, the first trio, Aaron's staff was used as a trigger. And God had a statement that he was making in all 3 of those first plagues. His statement, I am the Lord, a statement we've seen repeatedly. When you go to the second trio, every plague was begun by Moses giving a word, a command. And God was saying, hey, you guys, I am here in Egypt. And that was to be central to each of plagues 4, 5, and 6. When we get to the last trio, plagues 7, 8, and 9, they began when Moses commanded it, but he had the staff in his hand. Both things. The severity is increasing. And what was God saying to the Hebrews and to the Egyptians? I'm God. I am sovereign. I'm powerful. There is no one who can compare to me. So by way of review, let us take a look at this. The plagues occurred in 3 sets of 3 consecutive events each. In the first 2 plagues of each trio, Pharaoh was given a warning, but no warning in the third. The first in each trio began with a purpose statement. And then the severity increased through each plague. And it was increased from set to set, from plague to plague, and a different word was used in each of the 3 sets. The staff, the word, and then the word and the staff. And in each statement, or in each set, God was making a statement about himself that the Egyptians and the Hebrews were to learn. Well, what else? Well, in the next session, we're going to begin looking at the plague number 1. And we're going to use, through each of those 9 plagues, this format that we've just described. We'll look and use that format to analyze each plague in detail, because there are lots of things that need to be sought out that aren't obvious when you're simply reading. We'll begin with the water to blood as the first plague, but actually that's more than a plague. It was a sign. It was a miracle with a stated purpose. He was trying to get Pharaoh's attention, and got it. He did. But one final point. There's something different about the narratives of these plagues. Up to this point, we had a continual in and out of considering what was going on with the Hebrew people. What was their attitude? Were they up? Were they worshiping? Were they down? Were they not paying attention to Moses? Well, all of that just about disappears through these 9 plagues. The focus isn't on the Israelites, except when God's trying to make a separate point, a point, by the way, which will tell us that these were miracles and not purely natural events. Now, what are our takeaways? Number 1, God had a systematic, organized plan for the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. He wasn't just doing things as they came up. He was organized, There is structure to his strategy, and as we know, it worked. Number two, the pressure on Pharaoh increased with each succeeding plague. The succeeding plagues, or the plagues, got succeedingly more irritating or severe, and that put increasing pressure on Pharaoh. And finally, God will be seen by both Hebrew and Egyptian as superior to Pharaoh and as superior to all of the Egyptian gods. We're looking forward to being in the middle of that first plague, that first round of battle, to see that in our next session. Thank you.